Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about the idea of designing mechanics first for your game before doing anything else. This is actually in response to a question from This Is Fine, who asks, you've mentioned time and again that it goes setting, then story, and finally system mechanics. But what about the approach that some directors use, like Miyazaki or Ueda, to design mechanics, movement, levels, etc. first, and then develop a fitting story based on one, the lore established in the background, and two, the things that organically emerge while developing the game itself. First off, let me say, this obviously worked for them. They made great games, so that's great. I'll also say there isn't one magic bullet to making a great game. And anybody who tries to tell you there is probably trying to sell you something. What I'm telling you here is what I did and discovered worked for me, and therefore is what I recommend. I don't want to make up a theory about the best way to make a game and recommend it if I've never done it myself. So I have always done it in that order: setting, story, system mechanics. And it's always worked, and I've explained why it works. So I'm going to kind of walk through here why I do it that way and what I think of doing it the other way. So, in my experience, I have ideas for tons of mechanics. I told you I've got books all over the place. I got one right on my desk here where I think of something. I think of setting ideas. I think of story ideas. I think of mechanics ideas. I don't have any shortage of those. So it's never the case of, well, I'll work on one and then see what it makes me think of. So because I'm working from that direction, I have a lot of mechanics that would not work well together. They're literally antithetical. Everything from, well, if you use this mechanic, you're going to have to do save games a certain way. Or if you use this mechanic, it will limit what kind of player characters can be made. So the mechanics not only don't, some mechanics don't work well with each other, they don't work well with other things. So, and I should point out that even ones that do work well together, mechanics I come up with that do work well together, they may set such a limiting constraint on the resulting settings or stories that they would work on that it's really going to limit what we can do in those areas. And remember, there are a lot of people, non-system mechanic designers, artists, who want to contribute to what the setting and story are going to be. But if you go the other direction and you start with mechanics, you're like, well, that's a great story idea, but these mechanics don't fit it. Or, oh, I love that setting, but it really doesn't make sense with this mechanic. So that's why I don't like to do that, because the people who aren't involved in the mechanics will be constrained by it and will ultimately feel like somewhat of a straitjacket when you're trying to, hey, let's come up with a good story. I like instead thinking of, wow, I have this idea for a setting, and somebody goes, oh, I love that. Do you know what would be a good story to tell in that? Great. You know what we can do to support that story? I can have this mechanic and this mechanic in the game that shores up that story. Now, when you go in the direction I go, which is setting, story, system mechanics, this has a lot of things that just flows from that. First of all, like I said, artists and story designers can have a say in things about the setting and the story without a limitation, because you're not talking about system mechanics yet. So if, say, one of your artists said, I really want to do a really cool Art Deco look for the setting. Well, if everybody likes that and they think, oh yeah, and they have some really cool concept art, like, look what I drew, they would look like this. What kind of story would be told in a setting like that? And what I love about that is it's very hard to go the other direction. In Fallout, when Leonard had the idea of making it be what the 50s thought the future was, we were still trying to support all of the GURPS generic skills and attributes and advantages. So it wasn't, that part of the mechanics weren't in any way going to be a constraint. But I can tell you, when we replaced GURPS, a lot of thought went into those mechanics based on what our setting already was. We suddenly were like, it's important to have radiation mechanics. It's important to have poison mechanics. It's important to have skills and perks that are going to support certain things we know the player will want to do because we've got enough of the game written already that we know they try to do them. So that was important. A second reason going setting, story, mechanics, I think works well is this to lets you decide what mechanics to use from the enormous space of possibility of mechanics. Now, I know people go, well, the reverse is true. Once you put some pins in mechanics, it kind of defines what kind of setting and story you can tell. And I'm like, that's true. But I just said how much it constrains all the non-system mechanics people, which there are way more people on your team who aren't thinking about system mechanics than ones that are. And because, like I said, there are so many system mechanics out there, I've rarely felt like someone has said, hey, let's tell this story in this setting. And I'm like, I have no idea for a system mechanic for that. No, it's still the problem that I'm usually like, I have dozens of ideas. I wonder which ones we should use. So I've never felt too constrained mechanically by the setting and story, but the reverse happens a lot. The other thing I will say is because you're doing the mechanics after picking setting and story, and I've talked about how mechanics can conflict with each other or conflict with those, you end up picking ones to support the setting and the story, to reinforce things about them. That automatically makes your mechanics feel more coherent, like they belong in the game. Maybe you've played a game and it's got a mechanic and you're like, why is this here? Why am I being forced to do this or play this way? It seems antithetical to what the game is telling me you should play like. Especially if you've played a fantasy game where people seem surprised that you spoke with the dead or raised the dead or healed someone who was blind. And it's like, would you please look around? We're in a fantasy world. Why are you surprised about this mechanic? And it was because either the mechanic was put in without any idea of how it would change the story or the setting, or the mechanic came first. And then the setting was made either independently of it or without too much feeling like they need to be too constrained. I like, because the people who make mechanics tend to be a little more left-brained. I like that once the setting and story have pins put in them, you pick mechanics that support them. Those mechanics automatically feel more coherent and that they go together. And then the final reason I want to talk about this, which may be more directly tied to my experience as opposed to the game directors that the question asker asked, is I find that more often than not, when publishers first approach you, they ask first about the setting more than anything else. And often they will approach you, sometimes wanting work in a particular setting. I've been, at Troika, the first thing they asked is, well, what kind of game it is? And we said it's a fantasy game that's undergoing an industrial revolution. They didn't know or care. Oh, by the way, the skills have an orthogonal training system attached to them. So they increase in ranks and training. No one ever asked me that. Similarly, when we were approached for the next two Troika games, they came with a setting already. They were like, will you do D&D? Will you do World of Darkness? And it's like, Then for story, that was the second thing that Atari asked. Like, well, what module would you pick? And the discussion of mechanics came later when I was like, hey, I may not be able to do Bard or Paladin, and obviously I did. But that came later. And even if you're making an original IP, they may later bring up mechanics in a discussion. But I find that most publishers, the closest they come to asking you a question about the mechanics is when they ask you, well, are you doing anything original? Is there any hook? Is there anything that this game does that other games don't do? And frequently that's a mechanics question. But that's the closest I've ever gotten to a publisher asking for or demanding a mechanic outside of, hey, can we put some microtransactions in this, or can you put a tutorial level in? And to me, that's kind of outside the scope of system mechanics. It's not in world system mechanics. It's something they're thinking of at the meta level. So I hope this answered your question. This is fine about why I go setting, story, system mechanics. Other directors may go the opposite direction, and it worked great for them. This is all I know. This is what I think works, and this is why I think it works. So I hope that answered your question.